The night before the Empire's most important military parade, General Aldric's warhorse had already broken one man's arm. He had shattered 2 saddle racks into splinters. And he had refused violently, decisively, without a single moment of hesitation, every rider, every groom, and every senior stable hand in the entire barracks. 3 of the Empire's most experienced horse handlers stood outside Kestrel's stall now, breathing hard, nursing bruised hands and wounded pride. One of them had a torn sleeve. Another had lost his footing so badly that he had slid across the stable floor and crashed into a water trough. The third man, Sergeant Bram, chief groom of the Imperial Barracks, a man who had been working with military horses for 22 years, simply stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, staring at the stall door like it had personally insulted him. Inside, Kestrel paced. You could hear it, that heavy, rhythmic thud of hooves on packed earth, back and forth, like something caged that had never quite accepted the cage. General Aldric stood 15 feet away, in full uniform, saying nothing. His aide-de-camp stood at his shoulder, also saying nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. The parade was at dawn. The reviewing officers would arrive from 3 provinces. The Empire's most decorated general could not, absolutely could not, appear on foot. And yet, Kestrel was not moving for anyone. That was when the boy appeared. He came from the far end of the stable corridor, walking slowly, carrying a bucket of water and a brush. He had straw in his hair. He was wearing no uniform, no rank insignia, nothing that suggested he belonged anywhere near a military parade or a general or a horse worth more than most men earned in a decade. He looked maybe 16 years old. He was slight. He was quiet. His boots were cracked at the left heel. Nobody looked at him. Nobody ever looked at him. But Kestrel did. The great horse stopped packing. His ears came forward. And in the long, terrible silence of that stable, with a general watching and 3 grooms failing and an empire holding its breath, the warhorse turned his enormous head toward the boy and was completely, utterly still. Nobody recognized the stable boy. But the horse already knew exactly who he was. His name was Eli Crane. And if you had asked anyone in the Imperial Barracks about Eli Crane, they would have told you 2 things very quickly and with very little sympathy. The first thing they would have told you is that he was the stable boy. Not a groom. Grooms had rank, had training certificates, had the right to stand near horses of military value. Eli was the stable boy. He filled water buckets. He swept straw. He cleaned tack that other people used and repaired fencing that other people broke. He was in the strict hierarchy of the barracks, somewhere below the junior kitchen staff, and just above the stray cats that wandered in from the eastern courtyard. The second thing they would have told you is that he was Crane's son. And the way they said it, Crane's son, would have told you everything you needed to know about why nobody looked at him. Captain Aldous Crane had been a cavalry officer of some considerable skill. By all accounts, the accounts that people gave quietly in corners when they were sure no one important was listening, he had been one of the finest riders the Empire had produced in a generation. He had a gift for horses that bordered on the unnatural. They responded to him in ways that experienced trainers couldn't explain and didn't particularly want to examine too closely, because it made their own expertise feel somehow insufficient. But Captain Aldous Crane had been executed for cowardice 7 years ago. That was the official record. That was what the court-martial papers said. That was what the barracks commander had read aloud to the assembled regiment on a cold morning in early winter. 7 years passed, while a 6-year-old boy sat in the back of a supply cart outside the gates, because there was nowhere else for him to go, and no one had thought to ask what would happen to him afterward. The army had kept Eli, not out of sentiment, out of practicality. He was small enough to fit into stall spaces that adults couldn't, quick enough to calm a frightened horse before it damaged itself, and quiet enough that you could almost forget he was there. He cost nothing beyond scraps from the kitchen and a corner of the hay loft to sleep in. He had grown up in that hay loft. He had grown up watching horses. And in the years between his father's execution and this particular night, the night before the parade, the night of Kestrel, Eli Crane had become something that no one in the barracks had a word for, because they had never thought to look closely enough to need one. He had become the best person with horses any of them had ever encountered. They just didn't know it because they had never watched him work. Not really, not with attention. He was the stable boy. You didn't watch the stable boy the way you watched a trained groom or a cavalry instructor. You noticed him the way you noticed a good door hinge, only when something went wrong. Marta had watched him, though. Marta was the only stable hand in the barracks who had ever spoken to Eli Crane with anything resembling warmth. She was a stout woman in her late 40s, with weathered hands and the kind of practical intelligence that comes from spending 30 years doing physical work that most people consider beneath them. She had been at the barracks before Eli was born. She had known his father. That was something she and Eli had never quite spoken about directly. It lived between them instead, in the way she sometimes looked at him when he didn't know she was watching, and in the way he sometimes paused near the old photographs pinned to the tack room wall, photographs of cavalry officers from campaigns past, before moving on without comment. One evening, 3 weeks before the parade, Marta had found Eli sitting outside the stall of a nervous young mare who had been biting at anyone who came near her. The mare was standing calmly. Eli was not doing anything in particular. He was simply sitting. "How long have you been there?" Marta had asked. "About an hour," Eli said. And she just settled. She needed someone to not need anything from her, Eli said. Everyone who comes in wants her to be calm. Horses feel that wanting. It makes them worse. Marta had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had said quietly, "You know Kestrel arrived last month. Nobody's managed him. Not in 3 months at his last posting either, apparently. Not since they brought him back from the northern campaign." Eli said nothing. "He was the companion horse of General Aldric's previous mount," Marta continued. "His name before the army got hold of him was Arrows. That was his brother. Arrows died in the field 18 months ago." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, "So Kestrel is grieving." Marta blinked. "Horses don't grieve." Eli looked at her then with an expression that was not unkind but was very certain. "You've never lost anyone," he said. Marta had no answer for that. She stood there for a moment in the doorway, and then she walked away, and she didn't bring it up again. But she thought about it. She thought about it a great deal over the following weeks, in the way you think about something that has rearranged a small but important part of the furniture in your mind. She also thought about something else, something she had never told Eli because she wasn't sure it was her place, and because she had spent 20 years telling herself it didn't matter anymore and had almost convinced herself that was true. Captain Aldous Crane, Eli's father, had known General Aldric personally. Not as subordinates know their superiors. Personally. They had served together in the same regiment for 4 years. It was Crane who had been responsible for Aldric's horses during those campaigns. It was Crane who had a particular fondness for a young stallion called Arrows, who had been assigned to Aldric's unit and who Crane had trained almost from birth. And there was something else. Something that Marta knew and that General Aldric, in all probability, did not. But that is a story for later. Because first, we need to talk about the night Kestrel refused everyone, and what happened when a boy with cracked boots and straw in his hair walked into that stall and changed everything. Sergeant Bram had not wanted to suggest Eli. He had, in fact, spent approximately 45 minutes exhausting every other option available to him before the words had come out of his mouth, and even then they had come out less as a suggestion and more as a kind of desperate, humiliated mumble that he immediately wished he could take back. "There's the boy," he said, "Crane's boy. He has a way with the difficult ones sometimes." General Aldric turned to look at Bram with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite confusion, but was somewhere uncomfortable in between. "The stable boy," Aldric said. "Yes, sir. You are suggesting I allow the stable boy to handle a horse that has injured 3 of your trained staff?" Bram's jaw tightened. "I'm suggesting, sir, that we are out of options and it is 3 hours until dawn." There was a silence that lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. Then Aldric said, "Bring him." Bram found Eli where Eli usually was at that hour, in the far end of the stable, finishing the evening water rounds, moving quietly between stalls with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has done the same task so many times that it has become a kind of meditation. He looked up when Bram approached. He did not look surprised. He rarely looked surprised. He had the eyes of someone who had learned very early that the world was not going to offer him warnings before it changed. "The general wants you to try Kestrel," Bram said. "He said it the way you might say something you don't believe and don't want to be held responsible for." Eli set down his bucket. "All right," he said. Bram had expected protest, or fear, or at the very least a request for some kind of protection or preparation. He got none of those things, just those 2 words, and then the boy was walking, and Bram had to move quickly to keep up, which irritated him in a way he couldn't entirely explain. When Eli reached the area outside Kestrel's stall, the small crowd that had gathered, Aldric, his aide-de-camp, 2 junior officers, and Marta, who had appeared from somewhere without anyone noticing, parted without quite intending to. Not because of anything the boy did, simply because of the direction he was walking and the steadiness with which he walked it. Aldric studied him. He was not what Aldric had expected. The boy was young, yes, but it wasn't the youth that struck him. It was the quality of his stillness. He was not performing calm the way people perform calm when they are actually frightened. He was simply calm. There was a difference. Aldric had spent 30 years in the field reading men under pressure, and he knew the difference immediately and instinctively, the way you know the difference between ice that will hold your weight and ice that won't. Eli stopped in front of Kestrel's stall. He didn't open it immediately. He stood there for a moment, maybe 10 seconds, maybe 15, just standing, not looking through the gap in the door, not making sounds, not doing anything that any of the experienced grooms would have recognized as a technique. Just standing, being present. Then he opened the stall door and walked in. What happened next is difficult to describe without making it sound more dramatic than it was. Because the truth is, it was not dramatic. That was precisely the point. Eli moved to the left side of the stall, not the center. He set down the brush he was carrying. He had brought it without anyone telling him to, and he crouched down, not to pick anything up, but simply to make himself smaller. Less like a threat and more like a feature of the room. He looked at the floor, not at the horse. Kestrel snorted, stamped once, moved to the far corner. Eli did not react. He did not look up. He simply sat with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to prove. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. Outside the stall, nobody spoke. Bram had opened his mouth twice and closed it both times. Aldric had not moved. His aide-de-camp had the good sense to simply watch. At the 4-minute mark, Kestrel took 1 step toward the boy. Then another. The horse lowered his head, that huge, proud, battle-trained head, and pushed his nose toward Eli's shoulder. Not violently, gently, the way horses greet someone they recognize. Eli brought his hand up slowly and rested it on the side of Kestrel's face. And then he leaned close. His lips moved. He was saying something quiet enough that no one outside the stall could hear it. The narrator catches only part of it, a word spoken twice like a name, not Kestrel's name, a different name. A name that made the horse's whole body shudder once softly, the way a person shudders when they hear a song from a very long time ago. Outside, Marta pressed her hand to her mouth. She knew what name it was. She was the only one. What happened next, though, that was the moment Sergeant Bram truly could not stand. Because Bram was a proud man. He was a man who had built 22 years of professional identity on knowing horses better than almost anyone in the empire. And watching a 16-year-old stable boy with cracked boots do in 5 minutes what he had been unable to do in 3 hours was not simply humiliating. It was destabilizing. It shook something in him that he did not want shaken. So he did something foolish. He pushed open the stall door. "That's enough," he said, voice tight. "The horse needs to be." Kestrel's head came up instantly. His ears went flat. He sidestepped hard, hooves crashing against the stall wall, and Eli was on his feet in the same moment, moving between the horse and the noise, hands raised, speaking quietly and urgently. It took another 3 minutes to bring the horse back down. One of Aldric's junior officers grabbed Bram's arm and pulled him back from the doorway. Bram didn't resist. He stood there, outside the stall, staring at the floor, his face a complicated arrangement of shame and anger and something else, something underneath both of those things that had no easy name. Aldric said nothing to Bram. He watched Eli work. And somewhere in the back of his mind something moved, some memory, some recognition. He couldn't place it. It was the feeling of almost remembering the words to a song. It took Eli 40 minutes to saddle Kestrel. Not because there were problems, because he did not rush. He worked through each stage the way a craftsman works, with attention and intention and the absolute absence of hurry. He checked each strap not once but twice. He spoke continuously in that low, private voice, moving around the horse with a familiarity that should not have been possible between a boy and an animal he had never formally worked with. When it was done, he led Kestrel out of the stall. The horse walked beside him like they had done this 1,000 times. The small crowd parted again. Someone exhaled an audible, released breath of relief that carried all 3 hours of the night's tension in it. The junior officers exchanged glances. Bram stared at the floor. And then General Aldric stepped forward. He stepped forward and he looked at Eli properly for the first time. Not a glance, not an assessment of utility. He looked at the boy the way you look at something that has just refused to be what you thought it was. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Aldric's aide-de-camp, filling the silence the way aide-de-camp always do, said quietly, "The boy handled him well, sir." "He did," Aldric said. Then to Eli directly, "What did you say to him, in the stall?" Eli looked up. He had a steady gaze. He did not look away from generals any more than he looked away from horses, because he had learned a long time ago that looking away was not the same as being safe. "I said a name, sir." "Whose name?" A pause. "Arrows." The word landed like a stone in still water. Aldric's expression did not collapse. He was too disciplined for that. But something moved behind his eyes, something significant, something that crossed his face so quickly you would have missed it if you weren't watching closely. And Eli was watching closely because Eli always watched closely. "Where did you hear that name?" Aldric said. His voice was very controlled. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father used to say it, when he thought no one was listening. He said arrows was the bravest thing he had ever known. A beat. Besides you, sir." Aldric went completely still. It was not the stillness of composure. It was the stillness of a man who has just been handed something he did not know was missing. "Your father," Aldric said slowly. "Yes, sir." "What is your father's name?" "Crane, sir, Captain Aldous Crane." The silence that followed was unlike any of the silences that had come before it that night. Those had been tense, or awkward, or heavy with the weight of professional failure. This silence was something else. This was the kind of silence that happens when history rearranges itself in someone's mind, and all the other noise has to stop to make room for it. Aldric turned away, just slightly, just enough that Eli could not see his face directly. His aide-de-camp, who had been with the general for 11 years and had learned to read the man's silences the way sailors read weather, took one careful step backward and became very interested in the middle distance. It was Marta who moved. She had been standing in the doorway of the stable this whole time, and now she walked forward, not quickly, not with drama, but with the purposeful quiet of someone who has been waiting a long time to stop waiting. She stopped next to Eli and she put her hand briefly on his shoulder, just once. Then she looked at General Aldric. "Sir," she said, "there are things you should know about Captain Crane." Aldric turned back. His face was composed again, but the composure was effortful now in a way it had not been before. "I know what happened to Captain Crane," he said. "No, sir," Marta said very gently. "You know what the record says happened to Captain Crane. Those are different things." What Marta told General Aldric in the next 20 minutes is something that must be told carefully, because it is the kind of truth that doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, from multiple directions at once, and you don't realize the full shape of it until you're standing inside it. Captain Aldous Crane had not been executed for cowardice. He had been executed for disobedience, and he had been disobedient for a very specific reason, on a very specific night 7 years ago, during the retreat from the northern ridge. The regiment had been ordered to pull back, full retreat, standard order under a commander who did not tolerate deviation. Every man was to move immediately or be left. One man had not moved immediately. That man was General Aldric, not yet a general then, only a colonel, lying in the mud of the northern ridge with a wound in his side that he did not yet know was not fatal, and no one to tell him otherwise because everyone was leaving. Everyone except Captain Crane. Captain Crane had stayed. He had gotten the colonel onto a horse, Arrows, because Arrows was the one horse who would stand still under the sound of rifle fire, who had been trained by Crane himself for exactly that steadiness. He had gotten the colonel out. He had carried him 4 miles in the wrong direction to avoid the retreating fire lines, which meant he arrived back at the regiment's position 2 hours after the retreat had completed. The commanding officer at the time, a man named Forsyth, who had reasons of his own for wanting Crane discredited, had called it desertion. The court-martial had been fast. The record had been sealed. Forsyth had been promoted 6 months later and died of fever 2 years after that, taking whatever private knowledge he carried with him. Aldric had been told that Crane was executed for abandoning his post during the retreat. He had been told this while still recovering from his wound in a field hospital 3 provinces away. He had mourned Crane briefly, guiltily, the way you mourn someone you feel you should have saved and couldn't. And then he had gone back to the war, because the war was always there, and the war did not care about guilt. He had never known. He had never known that the man who saved his life had been executed for saving his life. He had never known that the man left behind a 6-year-old boy. He had never known that the boy grew up sleeping in a hay loft 20 feet from the horses that Crane had loved, learning from them the same things Crane had learned, carrying the same patience and the same stillness and the same impossible gift in his hands. Aldric listened to all of this without speaking. When Marta finished, the stable was completely silent. Kestrel stood calmly beside Eli, the saddle gleaming in the lamplight. Eli had not moved. He stood with the reins in his hand and his eyes on the ground, and his expression was the expression of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just discovered that someone else finally knows about the weight. Aldric turned to look at the boy. He looked at the hands first, the shape of them, the particular way the fingers held the reins, not gripping, just resting, the way a man holds something he trusts. Then he said it. You have your father's hands." Eli looked up. And whatever Eli Crane had spent 7 years building around himself, whatever armor a boy builds when the world tells him repeatedly and thoroughly that he is worth nothing, that his father was worth nothing, that the blood in his veins is a thing to be ashamed of, all of it, in that moment, with those 5 words, simply and completely gave way. He did not cry. He was too much his father's son to cry in a stable yard in front of a general. But his jaw tightened, and he breathed in once very carefully, and his hand tightened slightly on the reins, and Kestrel turned his head and pressed his nose against the boy's shoulder, the way horses do when they sense something important is happening. "He talked about you," Eli said. His voice was steady but only just. "He talked about you a lot. He said you were the most honest soldier he had ever known. He said that you would have stayed too if the positions had been reversed." A pause. "He wasn't angry, I want you to know that. He wasn't angry at you. He just wanted someone to know what actually happened." Aldric said nothing. He had spent 30 years in command of other men. He had made decisions that cost lives and decisions that saved them, and all the complicated decisions in between that could have gone either way on a different day with a different wind. He had been decorated and praised and feared and respected. He had never, in all of that, felt smaller than he did in this moment, standing in a stable in the middle of the night, being looked at by a 16-year-old boy with straw in his hair. In the doorway, Sergeant Bram quietly removed his hat. He did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say, and for once in his life he seemed to understand that, and he stood there holding his hat with both hands, and his face was not the face of a man who had just lost a professional argument. It was the face of a man who had just realized he had been wrong about something more important than horses. The parade took place at dawn, as planned. General Aldric rode Kestrel through the reviewing grounds with the precision and composure that had made him famous across 3 provinces. The officers from the visiting delegations saw exactly what they were supposed to see. An empire's finest general, on a remarkable horse, demonstrating exactly the kind of controlled authority that kept empires running. None of them knew what had happened in the stable in the hours before. None of them knew about the boy. That was all right. Some things are not meant to be seen by crowds. In the weeks that followed, Aldric did several things. He did them quietly. He did not make speeches about them or announce them through official channels in the way that might have generated attention or admiration. He simply did them, the way a man does things when he is motivated by obligation rather than performance. The first thing he did was request access to the sealed court-martial records of Captain Aldis Crane. The second thing he did was write a series of letters to the Military Records Office, to the Office of the Judge Advocate General, to 2 former colleagues who had served in the Northern Campaign and whose memories, when formally requested, turned out to be considerably more detailed about the events of that night than the official record suggested. The third thing he did was commission Marta, quietly, without ceremony, to go through the personal effects that had been stored in the barracks archive after Crane's execution, effects that no one had ever collected because there was no one to collect them. Among those effects were letters. 11 letters in Crane's handwriting addressed to Colonel Aldric, Aldric's rank at the time, written during the weeks between Crane's arrest and his execution. Letters that had been intercepted and filed and never delivered. Letters that described, in Crane's careful and straightforward prose, exactly what had happened on the northern ridge, exactly why he had stayed, exactly what he had done. And at the end of the last letter, one line that Aldric read 3 times before he put it down. "Tell my boy, if you ever find him, that the horses will know him. They always know their own." On a morning 2 months after the parade, Eli Crane was summoned from the hay loft. Not by Bram, by Aldric's aide-de-camp, which was unusual enough that everyone in the stable yard stopped what they were doing and watched without pretending not to. He was brought to Aldric's private office, a room he had never been in, a room he had never expected to be in. Aldric stood when Eli entered. That detail is worth noting. Generals do not typically stand when stable boys enter the room. Aldric stood. He told Eli about the letters. He placed them on the desk, all 11 of them, in a worn leather folder, and he said that he intended to have the court-martial record reviewed and corrected, that it would take time because these things always take time, but that the outcome was not in question. Captain Crane's record would be corrected. His name would be restored. Eli sat across the desk from the most powerful man he had ever spoken to and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "He would have said you didn't owe him anything." "I know," Aldric said. "He was wrong." Another pause. "What happens to me?" Eli asked. Not desperately, not with any particular agenda, simply because it was the practical next question, and Eli had always been a practical person. Aldric was quiet for a moment. "What would you like to happen?" Eli considered this with genuine seriousness. "I'd like to work with Kestrel properly, not as a stable boy, as I don't know what the word is. I don't want a rank. I just want to do the work correctly." "The word is trainer," Aldric said. "All right," Eli said, "then that." Aldric nodded. "Done." That was the whole conversation. No grand gestures, no tearful speeches. Two people in a room making a practical arrangement that was also, if you looked at it from a certain angle, which Aldric did, alone, later that evening. A kind of apology spanning 7 years, and delivered to the wrong generation because the right one was no longer available. It was not enough. Nothing would have been enough. But it was true, and it was real, and in Aldric's experience, true and real were the most you could honestly offer. That evening, Eli went back to the stable. Not because anyone sent him, not because there was work that needed doing, just because it was where he went when he needed to think, and Kestrel was there, and Kestrel was, in some way he couldn't have articulated to anyone, the closest thing he had to a continuous connection with the world his father had lived in. He sat in the corner of the stall, back against the wall, knees drawn up. Kestrel stood over him for a moment, then slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a horse that has decided something, lowered himself onto the straw and lay beside the boy. Horses don't do that. Trained military horses especially don't do that. Kestrel did it. Eli put his hand on the horse's neck and sat there in the warm dark of the stall with the smell of straw and leather around him, and he thought about his father. He thought about a man he had barely known, a man who had stayed when everyone else had left, who had saved a life without any expectation of credit, who had faced a court-martial and a firing squad without, apparently, becoming bitter. He thought about hands. He looked at his own. They were his father's hands, the general had said. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was, in fact, everything. Nobody recognized the stable boy. For 7 years, he carried water and swept straw and fixed fences and spoke to horses in a voice that no one bothered to hear. He was Crane's son. He was the bottom of the world. He was the kind of person that history forgets because history doesn't think to look in hay lofts. But Kestrel recognized him. From the very first moment, from that first turn of the great horse's head in the lamplight of the stall, Kestrel knew exactly whose hands those were. Because grief knows grief, and blood, apparently, carries more than just itself. There are thousands of people in history like Eli Crane, people who did extraordinary things without credit, who carried impossible weights without complaint, whose names are sealed in court-martial records or buried in archive folders or lost completely because no one thought to write them down. This was one of them. If this story stayed with you, if something about a boy in a hay loft and a horse that wouldn't move for anyone else felt like something worth remembering, then drop one word in the comments. Just one. Whatever this made you feel. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this, Stories that history tried to forget, then subscribe. Because I find one every week, and I'd hate for you to miss the next one.